at a crossroads in the United States. 70% of our manufacturing industries are now under severe competitive challenge. They're under severe competitive challenge because we lost our way on the basics: quality, service, the ability to innovate rapidly. We now need to take bold steps to make a comeback. The time for incremental action is past. Product life cycles, whether one is a local banker, a mom-and-pop corner store owner, or a local insurance broker, new product and new service life cycles must be reduced by 50 or 75%. Quality improvement objectives of 100, 200, 300, 400, and 500% are a must if we're going to survive, let alone thrive. Indeed, these steps will take place one day at a time, and I remain an avowed incrementalist. But on the other side of the coin, the objectives must be soaring ones indeed. We must talk about rapidly putting everyone who works for us on a profit-sharing plan. We must talk very quickly about taking customer satisfaction and putting it on the front burner, and then putting the people responsible for customer satisfaction, the receptionists and the salespeople and the dispatchers, at the very top of our hierarchy and organization chart, not at the bottom. These are the kind of actions that are required. We must begin today. What I primarily want to talk about is the good news. What is happening? Who are the winners? What are the strategies that the winners are using? Who are these winners? Where do we find them? When I began my work in these areas back in 1979, I focused on, frankly, the good giant companies, the Procters & Gamble's, the Hewlett-Packards, the Johnson & Johnsons. In the last few years, I've really shifted focus dramatically. My real interest is to say, can you survive in these dull and boring and battered and beaten corners of the economy? Is there any way to win, or must we just throw up our hands in despair? Well, there are ways to win, and I want to start my good news tale by giving you some of the examples of places where I see winners in all sorts of corners of the economy. But to do so appropriately, let me introduce a theme that will run through virtually all of my remarks. Way back in 1954, Peter Drucker wrote his landmark book, The Practice of Management. In it, he had a comment that rang all sorts of bells with me. He said simply, a business exists to create a customer. Customer is the watchword. Without a customer, there's no revenue coming in, there's no way to meet the payroll, there's no growth. The customer, the customer, the customer will be the drumbeat through all of these remarks. The customer. Let's talk specifics. Let's talk examples. Let's start with perhaps the most visible one of all, and that's the automobile industry. Well, how does all this work? How does it turn out? Well, it turns out pretty well. Carl Sewell, with one building and one brand of car, runs a $100 million plus business. That ranks him number 3 in the General Motors Cadillac family in new car sales, number 1 in service revenues, and he has literally set every record in the history of the Cadillac division of General Motors for customer satisfaction. That's what it does for him. That's the story of excellence in the battered part of the economy. In fact, the story is that in the pits of the Depression of 81 and 82, Carl Sewell continued to charge $1,000 to $1,500 premiums on his car and was buying up Cadillacs from all over the state of Texas, marking them up and selling them in his operation. Let's go back to that battered automobile business again. In late 1985, I named some most valuable players amongst businesses for their 1985 performance. To my delight, I was able with clear conscience to name both General Motors and Ford Motor Company in those categories. Ford for having what I consider one of the best quality programs in the United States, and General Motors for its bold, audacious start with its small car production Saturn program. That's great news. Both of them deserve those plaudits. However, the story as we look at the automobile industry is a stark and a grim one. Let me tell you exactly what I mean. Perhaps the data which is watched most closely by the auto industry is something called the Rogers Survey. It's data that the public doesn't see because it's taken and collected on a private basis, and the automobile companies are not allowed to use the Rogers data in advertising. The Rogers data has a wonderful little measurement. It measures what they call TGW, or things gone wrong. More specifically, things gone wrong per 100 cars produced during the first year after they were produced. Well, in 1970, when the import share of the market was only about 7%, the things gone wrong figure for U.S. cars was 500. For European cars, it was 300. For the Japanese, it was 200. Now, in the 1970s, particularly post-OPEC, American industry got a real battering. In fact, even with some import controls, the share of imports grew from 7 to 18% during that decade. Well, during that decade, despite their lead, the Europeans and the Japanese didn't sit still. The Europeans reduced their TGW scale from 300 to 200, and the Japanese, astonishingly enough, halved theirs from 200 all the way down to 100. In microeconomic courses, the first thing you learn on the first day is that when you're hit with a hard competitive threat, you react, and you react fast. Well, how did the Americans react during this 10-year period of threat to their well-being? The American score went from 500 up to 550. Not a pretty story, and quite an indictment for the lack of focus on quality in the American auto industry. Now, the good news is, and I hate to have stories that have unrelieved bad news, the good news is that during the last 5 years, according to this Rogers survey, the TGW score for Americans really has gotten an awful lot better. General Motors reduced theirs to 350. Ford went all the way down to 180 and even got better than the Europeans on the whole, and that's terrific. But once again, the sad story is that the Japanese, damn them, just refused to sit still, and Toyota, called by many the auto company for the rest of the century and on into the future, took their score all the way down to 60. So I said that then we got a little better during the past 5 years, but I don't want to stop there. I want to talk about more grimness. One of the other most respected polls is done by a Los Angeles organization called J.D. Power. J.D. Power measures the number of complaints during the first 90 days of automobile ownership. J.D. Power recently released their 1985 results in that regard. And let's take a look at among the 143 companies that they measured, let's take a look at the top 20. Who was in the top 20? Well, there were 12 Japanese models in the top 20. There were another 3 U.S. models that were made in Japan in the top 20. And what was the number 1 made U.S. car? Well, the Honda Accord, of course, made in Marysville, Ohio. And what was the number 1 car made in the United States and branded in the United States? It was the Ford Crown Victoria that came in a sparkling 16th place. That's the very best that we could do. Looking at the 143 as a whole, in terms of the fewest complaints in first 90 days per 100 cars produced, GM and Ford came in at 255, Chrysler at 315, and the Japanese at 169. It's just not pretty. Well, and as that all occurs, we know what's going on in other parts of the Japanese market. I haven't looked in the last few days, but the last time I checked, if you wanted to buy a Honda, you had to sit on a waiting list for about 6 months. And then after that 6 months wait, you were allowed to pay about $3,000 above list for the delight of owning a Honda motor car. My real point in belaboring these figures is to say we've worked like the dickens, we've worked our backsides off, our quality is getting better, and it's still pathetic relative to the competition. Well, at the year-end 1985, the protectionist drums were beating harder than they had ever beaten, and in fact, the Congress passed a major textile protection bill that the president, thank the Lord, vetoed during the waning days of that calendar year. The textile people were begging for mercy. They need relief, they say. Well, the reality is that we've been giving them relief for the last 30 years, and we haven't seen very much progress. 30 years break to reinvest. 30 years break to reinvest in manufacturing and product development. And what do we find after 30 years of protection? that the textile industry spends 0.5% of their gross revenue on research and development, which ranks them at the very bottom of all American industries in research and development spending. Lovely. Suddenly, after the veto of the protection bill, we understand that the textile companies have gotten together with the garment manufacturers, and they have figured out how to reduce their product development life cycle, that is, between the time of a gleam in the eye and getting a garment fully stocked on the retail shelves. They figured out how to reduce it now from 66 weeks to 21 weeks. The question that I just keep having to ask myself is, why did it take them until they were way past death's door with a plant closing every other week to figure out that they could cut the development cycle by 60%? I don't understand. And then we go to the wonderful high technology salvation of America in the West world, the world of chips, the semiconductor chips. Well, they have something called the 64K, standing for 64,000 circuits, 64K random access memory chip. The Japanese have taken 70% of that bread and butter market. Now the big deal is something called the 256K chip, the basic merchant semiconductor chip, and the Japanese have 90% of that market. Yes, indeed, you can find your set of screaming, clamoring people who will tell you that that's all because of Japanese dumping. But if you ask the people who have to buy chips as opposed to those who are making chips, you find out that the Americans lost the market for one plain and simple reason, and that is because the chips don't work. It's just about as simple as that. In fact, the company which blew the whistle on the American semiconductor industry back in 1980 was none other than the Hewlett-Packard Company, who said we can no longer put up with these rotten 16K chips if we're to make computers that work. So, when we look at everything from the chip market to the textile market to the automobile market, we can see all kinds of signs of waking up, but the pace simply is not adequate. We have a desperate possibility of losing more and more of our most basic industry, and with it goes the American standard of living. If there's anything that I find less attractive than stopping by the car dealer, it certainly has to be my lifelong and not particularly extraordinary, I fear, experience in having the television repaired. And if there is any market that anybody with good sense wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole, it has to be the violently competitive market for selling televisions and VCRs. By coincidence, there's another company in Dallas, Texas by the name of Curtis Mathis. Curtis Mathis is in that business of selling televisions and VCRs. Curtis Mathis has got the stupidest corporate logo of any company in America. In the most violently competitive market imaginable, their corporate logo is more expensive, but worth it. They have the audacity to regularly charge 25 to 30% price premiums, even on the $199.95 VCR. Well, does it work? Beats me. They're growing at about 35% a year. And last year, amongst their 750 franchisees, the people who run the Curtis Mathis home entertainment centers, the after-tax earnings were fully 265% higher than those for the appliance industry on the whole in that particular area. And what's their magic? Pure and simple: service, 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 service. Why are we losing in so many parts of the market? Why are the Curtis Mathis stories and the Sewell Village stories such anomalies? I don't have any magic to reveal. I have no secret formulas. It's waxing the floor in the middle of the night and washing it 3 times a day. It's teaching the mechanics interpersonal dynamics. The reason we've lost is not unlevel playing fields, not dumping by the Japanese, and not maliciousness. We've lost quite simply because the quality of our products are not good. The level of service that's offered in general is appalling. It takes us much too long a time to innovate. When we do sell our wares overseas, we don't bother to learn the language, and we don't bother to tailor the product for the overseas markets. And we continue to believe that the best way to survive is to build things that are bigger than other people's. The problem with that logic, quite simply, is that in the giant mega factory or mega enterprise, there's no focus on people. Commitment, concern, and care for quality and care for service happens when you've got no more than 100 or 200 in a facility. So the focus on people, the focus on quality, the focus on service, the focus on faster innovation, the focus on tailoring our products when we go overseas are the only news that we have to share. It's the obvious and it's common sense. What isn't common sense is that we practice common sense so seldom in our enterprises.